There is a particular kind of genius that changes not just the results of a game, but the grammar of it. Football has produced great scorers, great defenders, great tacticians. It has produced very few people who altered the language the sport speaks in. Johan Cruyff was one of them. To understand why his name still surfaces in press conferences and tactics boards half a century after his playing days, you have to go back to a narrow street in Amsterdam, to a family grocery shop, and to a boy who grew up almost literally inside a football stadium. Hendrik Johannes Cruyff was born in April 1947 in Amsterdam East, in a working-class district still rebuilding itself after the war. His parents ran a greengrocer's shop, and the family lived a modest, unremarkable life by the standards of the neighborhood. What made the Cruyff household different was its proximity to De Meer, the stadium of Ajax. The family shop supplied fruit and vegetables to the club, and young Johan spent hours on the pitches surrounding the ground, absorbing the rhythms of a game before he had the vocabulary to explain what he was seeing. He would later say that he learned football the way other children learn to speak, by being surrounded by it before he understood it. To appreciate how remarkable this trajectory truly was, it helps to remember what Dutch football looked like before Cruyff arrived on the scene. The Netherlands did not even turn professional as a football nation until 1954, trailing England, Italy, Spain, and other major footballing countries by decades. Dutch clubs were regularly eliminated in the early rounds of European competition, and the national team had not qualified for a World Cup since before the Second World War. Football in the Netherlands was, in the eyes of most of the continent, a provincial curiosity rather than a serious footballing culture. That a country with essentially no recent pedigree at the highest level could, within roughly a decade, produce both the dominant club side in Europe and a national team regarded as playing the most advanced football on the planet is difficult to explain through talent alone. It required a specific philosophical break from convention, and it required one player capable of executing that break with enough brilliance that the rest of the football world had no choice but to pay attention. His father died when Johan was 12, a loss that reshaped the family and pushed his mother to take work as a cleaner inside the Ajax offices. It was through her that Cruyff's bond with the club deepened further, and it was through a friend of the family, a groundskeeper named Henk Angel, that the boy was pulled ever closer into the club's youth structure. By the time he was 10, Cruyff was already registered with Ajax. He was thin, almost frail-looking, with knees that seemed too big for his legs, and coaches who saw him for the first time did not immediately see a prodigy. What they saw, if they looked twice, was a boy who understood space on a football pitch the way a chess player understands a board. Not as a collection of players, but as a set of relationships that could be manipulated. The man who would turn that raw intelligence into a doctrine was Rinus Michels, who took over as first-team coach of Ajax in 1965, the same year a teenage Cruyff made his senior debut. Ajax at the time was a mid-table Dutch club with little continental pedigree. Michels was a disciplinarian, a former Ajax forward himself, and he arrived with an idea that would take a few years to fully crystallize. That football did not have to be organized around fixed positions, that players could interchange constantly as long as the team as a whole maintained its shape, its balance between attack and defense, and its control of space. This idea needed an executor on the pitch, someone with the vision to make constant improvisation look like a coherent plan rather than chaos. Cruyff became that executor. What emerged over the following seasons came to be known as total football, though neither Michels nor Cruyff much liked the label, feeling it oversimplified something far more specific. The essence of the system was this: every outfield player had to be comfortable receiving the ball in tight spaces, comfortable playing it first time, and willing to move into whatever zone the team's structure required at a given moment, regardless of whether that zone matched his nominal position. A centre-back might surge forward into midfield. A winger might drop deep to overload the centre. The team pressed high to win the ball back quickly, and it circulated possession in a way that was less about individual flair and more about a shared, almost telepathic sense of where teammates needed the ball to be. Cruyff, nominally a centre-forward, roamed constantly, dropping into midfield, drifting to the flanks, dragging defenders out of position simply by being somewhere they did not expect a striker to be. Ajax's rise under this philosophy was rapid and for Dutch football, unprecedented. The club won the Eredivisie repeatedly through the late 1960s, and by the early 1970s, it had become the dominant force in European club football, lifting the European Cup 3 years running from 1971 to 1973. Cruyff was the fulcrum of that team, and in 1971, and again in the following 2 years, he was named the best footballer in Europe, an honour that in 1974 would be confirmed on a global stage as well. His body of work at Ajax was not only about goals, though he scored plenty. It was about a footballing intelligence so far ahead of its time that opposing coaches spoke of trying to contain him the way one might speak of trying to contain weather. One image from that era has outlived nearly everything else from Cruyff's playing career. A piece of skill invented, seemingly on instinct, in a World Cup match against Sweden in 1974. Facing a defender who expected a cross, Cruyff dragged the ball behind his own standing leg with the outside of his foot, spun completely away from the defender, and accelerated in the opposite direction before the marker had even registered what had happened. It was not a rehearsed trick. It was a spontaneous solution to an immediate problem, executed with such economy that it was given his name within days, and has been taught to children in football academies on every continent ever since. The Cruyff turn, as trivial as it might sound, reduced to a highlight reel clip, is in miniature the entire Cruyff philosophy. Solve the problem in front of you with the minimum necessary motion, and make the solution so elegant that it becomes doctrine. That 1974 World Cup deserves its own extended pause, because it is where Cruyff and the Dutch national team became a global phenomenon, even without lifting the trophy. The Netherlands arrived in West Germany without the pedigree of Brazil, Germany, or Italy, but playing a version of total football that stunned audiences unfamiliar with the Ajax model domestically. Orange became inseparable from a certain idea of attacking, intelligent, position-fluid football. The Dutch dismantled Argentina, brushed aside a strong Brazilian side that had begun to rely on physicality rather than the flowing football of 1970, and reached the final having played, by common consensus, the most captivating football of the tournament. In the final itself, against the host nation West Germany, the Netherlands scored inside the opening minute without a German player even touching the ball, a passage of over a dozen consecutive passes finished by a penalty won by Cruyff himself. It remains one of the most replayed opening sequences in World Cup history. West Germany recovered, exploited a Dutch side that some observers felt grew complacent, and won the match 2-1. The Netherlands went home without the trophy, but they went home as the team that had changed how the rest of the football world thought the game could be played. Cruyff was named the tournament's outstanding player. The loss stung for years inside the Dutch camp, and it produced a debate that has never fully settled among historians of the tournament. Whether the Netherlands, so far ahead tactically of everyone else on the pitch, became too confident in the final, more interested in humiliating their hosts through prolonged possession than in pressing for a second and third goal while the game was still open. Cruyff himself, in later interviews, tended to place the blame less on arrogance and more on a mental letdown following the opening goal, a brief loss of the ruthless intensity that had characterized the Dutch performances up to that point. Whatever the true explanation, the final has been replayed, dissected, and re-argued in Dutch football culture for 50 years, treated less as a defeat to be forgotten and more as a foundational myth. The moment a nation discovered that playing the most beautiful football in the world does not guarantee the trophy that is supposed to reward it. Off the pitch, Cruyff was already showing the independence of mind that would define his post-playing career. He refused to wear the third stripe on his Adidas-sponsored national team kit because he had a personal contract with Puma. A small but telling episode that revealed a man who treated even sponsorship logos as matters of principle rather than convenience. There were also, persistently, rumors about why he did not appear at the 1978 World Cup in Argentina, held under a military dictatorship. For years, the story was framed around a kidnapping attempt on his family in Barcelona that had left him unwilling to travel and leave his wife and children exposed again. Cruyff himself, decades later, gave a more layered account, describing discomfort with the political situation in Argentina at the time, alongside the personal security concerns. Whatever the precise mixture of reasons, his absence meant the world never saw Cruyff at a second World Cup, and the mythology of what might have been in 1978 has never quite faded. By 1973, Cruyff had already left Ajax for Barcelona in a transfer that, adjusted for the football economy of the time, was a world record. It was also, in its way, a political statement. Catalonia under Franco's regime had endured decades of suppressed identity, its language restricted in public life, its symbols discouraged. Barcelona's football club had long functioned as one of the few permitted outlets for Catalan pride, its motto often rendered as more than a club. Into this charged atmosphere arrived a Dutchman who, almost immediately, gave his newborn son the name Jordi, after the patron saint of Catalonia, at a time when Catalan names were still frowned upon by the Spanish civil registry. It was a small act, but in context it was unmistakably a gesture of solidarity, and Catalans understood it as such. On the pitch, his impact was just as immediate. In his first season at the club, Barcelona, who had gone more than a decade without a league title, won La Liga, with a Cruyff-inspired 5-0 demolition of eternal rivals Real Madrid, played in the Bernabeu itself, becoming one of the defining results in the club's history. Cruyff was voted European Footballer of the Year for the third time that same year, a feat achieved by very few players before or since. His playing career would eventually take him away from Europe's traditional powerhouses altogether to the nascent North American Soccer League, where he turned out for the Los Angeles Aztecs and later the Washington Diplomats, part of a wave of European stars, most famously Pelé, who helped popularize the sport in the United States during the 1970s. He returned briefly to Dutch football with Ajax and with Feyenoord, of all clubs, Ajax's fiercest domestic rival, before retiring from playing in the early 1980s. It was a career that had reshaped the sport as a player. What came next reshaped it again, arguably even more profoundly, as a coach and as an architect of institutions. Cruyff returned to Ajax as manager in the mid-1980s and immediately began reorganizing the club, not just tactically, but structurally. He promoted young talent with a boldness that unsettled the board, giving debuts to teenagers who would go on to define Dutch football for the next decade. Among them, a young defender named Frank Rijkaard, and a striker still finding his level named Dennis Bergkamp. He won domestic cups and a European Cup Winners' Cup with Ajax, but his more lasting contribution during this period was philosophical. He began insisting that Ajax's famous youth academy be restructured entirely around his footballing principles, so that an 8-year-old entering the academy would be taught the exact same positional concepts, the exact same first touch demands, the exact same pressing triggers that a first-team player would be expected to execute. This was the beginning of what is now known throughout football as the Cruyff model of youth development, still taught today at Ajax's academy and copied, in whole or in part, by clubs across the world. It is worth noting how unlikely this second act at Ajax actually was, given how the club had treated him a decade earlier. When Cruyff first retired from playing and drifted briefly toward business ventures that did not go well, including a poultry farming investment that left him in serious financial difficulty, it was in part the need to rebuild his finances that pulled him back onto the pitch in his mid-30s for spells with Levante, then Washington, then Los Angeles again, before Ajax and Feyenoord gave him one final domestic chapter. That he returned to management with Ajax only a few years after those struggles and immediately began dismantling and rebuilding the club's entire developmental philosophy from the ground up says a great deal about the force of conviction underneath the man. He was not simply protecting a legacy, he genuinely believed there was one correct way to develop a footballer, and he was willing to fight administrators, parents, and even his own coaching staff to see it implemented. In 1988, after friction with the Ajax board over control of transfers and club policy, Cruyff left for Barcelona once more, this time in the dugout. What followed was arguably the single most important managerial tenure in the club's history. Over 8 seasons, Cruyff built what became known as the Dream Team, a Barcelona side that won 4 consecutive league titles between 1991 and 1994, and in 1992 delivered the club's first ever European Cup, fittingly won at Wembley, the home of the English game, with a Ronald Koeman free kick settling the final against Sampdoria. But the trophies, as significant as they were, are almost secondary to what Cruyff installed at the club during those years. He established the positional principles, the insistence on playing out from the back even under pressure, the demand for technically gifted defenders comfortable in possession, and the emphasis on a deep reservoir of academy-trained players who understood the system before they ever kicked a ball for the senior side. He is, more than any other single figure, the reason Barcelona's academy, La Masia, became synonymous with a specific style of technical, possession-based football, rather than simply a pipeline for talent. The clearest evidence of how deep that influence ran arrived years after Cruyff had left the Barcelona dugout, in the form of a slight, unassuming midfielder he had personally promoted from the youth ranks during his time as coach, Pep Guardiola. Guardiola played under Cruyff, absorbed his ideas about tempo, spatial occupation, and the primacy of the ball, and later, as a manager himself, built teams at Barcelona, Bayern Munich, and Manchester City that many observers consider the most sophisticated expression yet of the principles Cruyff first sketched out at Ajax in the late 1960s. Guardiola has never hidden the lineage, describing himself repeatedly across the years as, in footballing terms, one of Cruyff's disciples, and crediting him directly for the foundational ideas behind the tactical school, now loosely referred to as positional play. It is not an exaggeration to say that a very large share of what is considered elite modern coaching, the insistence on numerical superiority in small zones of the pitch, the discomfort with long, aimless passing, the belief that a goalkeeper should be an additional outfield passer, traces directly back through Guardiola to Cruyff's own playing days under Michels. Cruyff's influence was never confined to systems and formations. He was, throughout his life, an unusually gifted communicator of footballing ideas, capable of distilling complex tactical relationships into short, almost proverbial phrases that stuck in the public imagination far more effectively than any coaching manual. He famously argued that every disadvantage has its own advantage, that quality without effort is worthless, and effort without quality is equally worthless, and that a good footballer needs perhaps 1 second more than an average one to make the right decision, and that the difference between the two is often invisible to everyone except the players themselves. Many of these sayings have taken on a life of their own in footballing culture, quoted by coaches with no direct connection to Cruyff at all. Evidence of how thoroughly his way of talking about the game seeped into the sport's broader vocabulary. He also carried, throughout his career, a reputation for bluntness that occasionally curdled into open conflict. He clashed repeatedly with club administrators, with federation officials, and at times with his own players, unwilling to soften an opinion simply because it was unwelcome. This same stubbornness, which cost him allies over the years, is inseparable from his achievements. A more conciliatory figure would very likely never have pushed Ajax's academy or Barcelona's youth structure through the institutional resistance both clubs initially offered. Cruyff himself seemed to regard the friction as a natural and even necessary cost of holding a strong, coherent footballing philosophy in an environment that often rewarded compromise instead. In his later years, Cruyff largely stepped back from day-to-day coaching but remained an influential, at times controversial voice inside both Ajax and Barcelona, frequently intervening publicly when he felt either club was drifting from the principles he had spent decades installing. He also devoted substantial energy to the Cruyff Foundation, established in the late 1990s, which funds sports facilities and programs for children with disabilities and children in disadvantaged communities around the world, an initiative that has since built hundreds of small-scale sports fields, known as Cruyff Courts, across cities on multiple continents. It reflected a belief he held since childhood, that access to organized play should not be the preserve of children born into privilege, and it stands today as one of the less discussed but most enduring parts of his legacy. Cruyff was diagnosed with lung cancer in 2015, a particularly bitter irony given that he had undergone heart surgery decades earlier, in 1991, after which he had become an outspoken advocate against smoking, having quit the habit himself following the operation. He fought the illness publicly for close to a year, continuing to write columns and offer opinions on the game he had spent his life reshaping, before he died in March 2016 at the age of 68. The reaction across the football world was immediate and global. Barcelona and Ajax both retired stadium sections and stands in his honor. FC Barcelona renamed the training ground where their first team and academy train, the Ciutat Esportiva Joan Gamper complex's main stadium, the Estadi Johan Cruyff, and Ajax renamed its own stadium, the Johan Cruyff Arena, an extraordinary honor for a stadium named while its subject was still fresh in living memory, rather than mythologized by distance. What makes Cruyff's story unusual, even among football's small pantheon of true innovators, is the sheer completeness of his influence across every layer of the sport. As a player, he embodied and popularized a style of play that had no real precedent in the way it dissolved fixed positions into fluid, cooperative movement. As a coach, he took that same philosophy and encoded it directly into the institutional DNA of two of the biggest clubs in world football, ensuring it would survive and multiply long after his own departure from either dugout. And through the players he mentored directly, most visibly Guardiola, but also many others who passed through Ajax and Barcelona under his watch, his ideas continued to evolve and spread into new generations of coaches who never played under him at all, absorbing his principles second-hand as though they were simply the natural, obvious way the game ought to be played. It is worth pausing on how strange that outcome actually is. Football is a sport of extraordinary tactical diversity, shaped over more than a century by countless national schools of thought, from the rigid English long ball tradition to Italian defensive organization to Brazilian improvisational flair. That a single Dutchman, working primarily across two clubs in a country of modest football history compared to the traditional powers, could embed a specific, coherent philosophy so deeply that it now competes as one of the dominant tactical languages of the entire sport, is a measure of just how forceful and how correct his underlying ideas turned out to be. Total football did not simply win trophies in the early 1970s and then fade as a historical curiosity, the way many once dominant tactical systems eventually do. It kept mutating, kept finding new hosts, and kept winning at the very highest level, decades after its supposed obsolescence, precisely because its central insight, that space and positioning matter more than rigid role assignment, was not a product of its era, but a genuine and lasting truth about the game itself. There is a reason coaches still reach for Cruyff's phrases in press conferences, why academy directors at clubs with no historical connection to Amsterdam or Barcelona still structure training sessions around principles he first articulated half a century ago, and why footballers who were children when he died still grow up learning a turn that bears his name without necessarily knowing the full story behind it. Johan Cruyff did not simply play the game brilliantly, though he did. He looked at football and saw, more clearly than almost anyone before him, what it could become if the sport stopped thinking in terms of fixed positions and started thinking in terms of space, relationships, and constant intelligent movement. That vision did not stay confined to one remarkable career. It became the foundation on which much of modern football, whether the public fully realizes it or not, still stands. Strip away the trophies for a moment, and the raw numbers alone still tell an unusual story. 3 European Footballer of the Year awards in the space of 4 seasons, a feat matched by almost no one across the decades since. A domestic league record with 2 different clubs in 2 different countries. A World Cup final reached without ever appearing in a World Cup again, and yet a tournament remembered more vividly than dozens of finals that were actually won. A coaching career that delivered a first-ever European Cup to one of the wealthiest and most historically decorated clubs on the continent, and a youth academy overhaul at another club that continues to this day to produce internationals for a country of barely 17 million people, punching consistently above its demographic weight on the world stage. Numbers, though, were never really the point with Cruyff, and he would likely have said so himself. The point was always the idea, the conviction that football, played correctly, was as much a matter of intelligence and geometry as it was of speed and strength, and that once you saw the game that way, you could never quite watch it the old way again.